Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still logging on, but just in the interest of time. So hi and welcome to the today's Institute of Behavioral Science Speaker Series, which is co-sponsored with the Environment and Society Program, the Natural Hazard Center, and the Department of Sociology here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so my name is Lori Peak, and it is a profound honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Jim Elliott is a professor of sociology and department chair, although on leave during the 2020-2021 academic year at Rice University. So Jim received his PhD in sociology with a minor in geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his strong sociological training, as well as his spatial analytical skills, are on full display in his expansive and influential body of research. Jim is a beloved teacher and mentor who has been widely recognized for his work both inside and outside the classroom to help train a next generation of sociological thinkers and skilled researchers. Jim is also a distinguished scholar whose work has been published in top outlets in the discipline, including the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, and Social Problems and Social Forces, just to name a few. Given the rigor of his work, it is no surprise that his research has been covered in dozens of top media outlets, making Jim one of the most powerful voices for public sociology in our discipline. His articles, as well as his recent 2018 co-authored book, Sights Unseen, Hidden Hazards in American Cities, have received numerous awards from various American Sociological Association sections, as well as other organizations, which speaks to the broad appeal of his work across the discipline. I had the chance to review Sights Unseen for a special American Sociological Association Author Meets Critics session at our annual meeting a few years ago. I commented then that the session should have been renamed Authors Meet Fans and Admirers. That book went on to win the 2020 Robert E. Park Award for the best book from the Community and Urban Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. Sights Unseen, like all of Jim's work, reads almost like a detective novel, as the book opens with a series of provocative questions that leave the reader wanting to find out the answers. Today, we are in for a similar treat, as we will hear from Jim regarding how rising wealth inequality and rising disaster losses are colliding in this nation ever more frequently, and what this means for some of our most marginalized populations. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over now to Dr. Jim Elliott. I hope you will join me in offering the warmest of virtual welcomes. Jim, over to you.
Thank you, Lori. Oh my gosh, it's always hard to follow Lori, even when she's introducing you and making it sound great. So I appreciate that, Lori, and Fernando as well for his invitation to spend some time here Monday with you, and for Eileen troubleshooting the tech stuff, which we know is so important. So speaking of tech stuff, I'm going to try to share my screen here, see if this works from the beginning. Okay, just a thumbs up if we got the, okay, great. I'm gonna try to hide my, there we go. What you love to see, professors talking to themselves while they use the computer. Okay, so today, what I'm gonna try to talk to you about is, as Lori mentioned, what I see and others see is two major challenges of our age, right? Rising inequality, particularly with regards to wealth, and these rising disaster costs and how they're connected. So this work is some work that I've done with the former grad advisee, now full colleague and friend, Junya Howell. So I'll be saying more about that and her efforts and our efforts here in a moment. What I'm gonna do, you're gonna see my hand occasionally because that's how I'm gonna advance the screen. But what I like to do is first step back for a moment and give you a sense of who I am as a sociologist and some of the big picture stuff. So I'm pretty sure that this book with my friend and colleague Scott got this award because of Lori's participation. She was outstanding in the author meets fans section. But what we try to do there is get to this principle that I see as important for social sciences in general, which is this idea of rendering the invisible visible. And so most of the time that as sociologists try to do that, we're spending our time trying to sort of render things like social networks or the effects of neighborhoods on life chances or institutional dynamics, these things we can't see but we know are so important, visible. In this book, Scott and I were really interested in trying to render these hazardous industrial sites where we're pretty sure that toxic contaminants still linger, but have gone unseen or been rendered invisible by how urbanization sort of scrubs that site clean with the reuse of that land for different purposes over time, but also through different policy mechanisms that only touch the tip of the iceberg. So there we're really just trying to bring to attention the vast problem of relic waste and legacy waste that we think are going to be especially important with floods and sea level rise and these sorts of things. So we're continuing to work on that aspect. And here is another project that I'm going to talk with you about today, and that's with Junia Howe. And there what we're trying to do, as you'll see, and you'll judge whether or not we're being successful, is render the environment visible in another way, and think about how we can look at the long-term effects of natural hazards and render those recoveries more visible, and how it is that the real disaster might be how we recover and not the actual physical impacts, and thinking about the methods we use for that and the data we might leverage. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. But to start, what I'd like to do is step back in time. Those of you who are familiar with sociology of disaster and allied fields know that, a big institutional influx of resources started in the 1950s, right? That's when the federal government said, hey, we should get some social scientists to study natural hazards, but it wasn't really to learn about natural hazards. As many of you might know, is really at the time we were engaged in the Cold War. And we were worried as a federal government, at least, what would happen if the Russians dropped a bomb on various towns or cities across the country. And there was no IRB at that time, but it was pretty clear you shouldn't go around bombing your own population to see what would happen. So the feds decided they let nature do the trick for them. So they allowed tornadoes and hurricanes and various things to be surrogates for these, big events. And the big question then boiled down, as far as I can understand it, is the feds want to know when they send the troops after these events, should they quarantine this area because the folks there have returned to some Hobbesian state of nature where they just are after each other and there are no social bonds, so you want to contain that? Or is it that they actually begin to help one another in a therapeutic sense, in which case the military can arrive and help reinforce and engage in that rebuilding that therapeutic community? And so hundreds and hundreds of case studies later, it became pretty clear that everyday folks in natural disasters didn't panic. If anybody panicked, it's our leaders. They're trying to figure out what to do and who's to blame and if they're going to be blamed. And so we came to the, some conversations about, therapeutic versus corrosive community. But what you'll note is, for a long time and coming to that conclusion, the questions of social inequality weren't really at the forefront of disaster research. That's not what the centers were being funded to study. That's not what the social scientists were studying. It was in there, but it wasn't central. Now we can fast forward to the 90s and early 2000s, and particularly hurricanes like Hurricane Andrew in Miami, and then Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf, and particularly in New Orleans, began to raise that social inequality picture or question to the fore. And so we begin to get pictures like this, where we see a narrative of inequality. We get snapshots where we have sort of victims or those who might be vulnerable and the heroes, or at least the people who are coming in nominally to restore order. And those questions are on the table, but I would argue that at the same time, those questions are still largely about the exposure or revealing of social inequality. So when the storm hits, it reveals or pulls back the veil of everyday life, and we see these inequalities. And so what Junie and I wanted to do is think about, well, what happens if we continue forward? And what is it about disasters that allows us to move forward? And if we're thinking about recovery, to what extent are recoveries and the way we sort of exercise those in our society part of the problem? How are they potentially not just disasters exposing social inequality, but the recovery is actually producing, driving, contributing to those inequalities? So in this picture, just wanted to sort of share this for a couple reasons. One, it's intellectual trajectory. I studied urban inequality and development. I was an assistant professor at Tulane in New Orleans, and didn't really pay too much attention to disasters. I had done a prelim in environmental sociology, but my environment was largely the social environment of different neighborhoods. And so this event happened. I happened to be in the city and went through it as the flood went down at a local hospital. And so it changed my intellectual trajectory. So this is sort of where I began to do what I do a little bit more consciously. But more importantly, what I want to show in this picture is the baby boy in the foreground there, because in many respects, the baby boy represents the innocent victim. Through no fault of his own, he's there in this precarious situation. But also, and more importantly, for this study, we want to think of that baby boy as the future. Where is he now? What are his life chances? What are the resources that his families have had over the past 15 years to actually make it in US society? So in thinking about that and thinking about the future, Junie and I wanted to sort of think about what that question does to bring us back to these two big challenges of our age. And so the first big challenge is the rising frequency and costs of disasters. And so you've probably seen a lot of graphs of this similar sort. Here two that I recently pulled. On the left side is, the accounting of natural disasters. We can debate the definitions, but over time globally, and obviously that line is going up, especially after the 1960s. So globally, we have an increased frequency. The science suggests that's not just because reporting got better, it's also because we're having more frequent events and we have more stuff in harm's way in more places. Then on the right-hand side, we see some of that illustrated in the rising costs of these big events. So these are the big storms or big hurricanes of sort of noted history in the US, and we can see that the big outliers are in 2017, 2008, 2012. So there are more and more of these high cost years. So that's one major challenge, right? The rising frequency and cost of these events. The other major challenge of our age that we're certainly not the first to point out, but we're concerned about, is rising wealth inequality. And as many of you know, we care about wealth inequality for lots of reasons. It's been hard to measure for a long time, so it wasn't really on the radar, but we've gotten better at that a bit. So we care about wealth and not just income inequality, say, because wealth is the stock of assets you have where you can invest in your child's future or your family's future. You can use it as a resource when a disaster hits or some other event happens to help you as a household rebound. And thirdly, we care about wealth inequality in particular because we know that it compounds over time. And so when we hear about rising wealth inequality, oftentimes we hear about it in historical terms, right? Here's the 1%, it's pulling away, or the top 0.1%, pulling away from the rest of US society. And it's reached, a level of disparity not seen for a century or so. And that's true and important. What we wanted to also focus on is that wealth inequality has been increasing not just historically, but if you want to say biographically or over individual lifetimes. So here's a graph from the Urban Institute for the US. It starts back in the left sort of tail of that with my parents' generation. They were born in the late 1940s. And at that point, the wealth gap between the average white American and the average African American was about threefold. And over time, that has grown to more than sevenfold. And so we have this divide, and this divide, we think, and we're not the only ones, is, has detrimental impacts, not just to those at the bottom who have fewer assets to invest, but that divergence weakens our social structure and our social infrastructure and creates a situation where we might not be as resilient as we need to be. And in fact, that resilience divergence might reflect different interests depending on what we have and the decisions we're making as we have children and accumulate wealth and pass that wealth on. So those are the two big trends, as I mentioned. And so we had two open sociological questions. In general, do natural hazards affect wealth inequality over time? We hadn't seen much research when we started to answer that question. And then what happens when Fema gets involved? Is there an effect on that answer, the first question? So those are the two main questions that I'm going to engage and talk with you a bit about for the rest of our time together. So when we think about the effects of natural hazards, notice I said natural hazards, and we can get into the nomenclature later, but oftentimes when people have looked at that question, they've gone more to an extended case study approach where they focus on major disasters. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, I picked deliberately a low impact year, 2015, 42 federally declared disasters. So one every 9 days, 8 or 9 days or so. A total of $1.2 billion in direct property damage. Just comparison, 2017, direct damages were 300 billion. And this year, 2020, we're chasing that level. And so here we are thinking about disasters, but part of, again, rendering the invisible visible is to think about, well, those are big impacts, but even if you have smaller impacts, if you're vulnerable, those could turn into disasters. So if you look at the other databases, what you find is in the same year, underneath that tip of the iceberg, we actually had about 558 natural hazards that caused some notable damage. And that damage was about 3- to 4-fold of what was declared in the federal disasters. So again, in moving towards the question of natural hazards impact on wealth inequality, we wanted to get a bigger picture of what was happening. And as we thought about that, we wanted to think about, well, what lies ahead with those hazards? So some of you may have seen this, but this is a piece by Benjamin Preston, who used this Sheldis database that we'll be using in this study, and you'll see in a moment, to basically average out what's the average effect nationally, controlling for inflation, of natural hazards since 1960. So the answer is about, the US has had about $7.6 billion of damage every year, direct impact to property, not crops, not injuries, just immediate property. Then the question is, what's going to happen in the coming decades? So Preston did a few simulations. None of them account for climate change. He said, okay, well, what if the building codes and the mitigation policies that we put in place actually work? And we just have the same average impacts over time. All that's going to matter is that the new stuff we keep building in the way, those building codes actually work. And in the best case scenario, no climate change, building codes work, we get the 13.7, or about a doubling of the hazard impacts on property by 2050. Then the higher estimate, the 28.9 billion, is what if the building codes don't work because the storms are getting stronger or the fires are getting worse, but no worse than we would expect historically. So that's a quadrupling. Then that gray line is the unknown. What if all that happens, then building codes aren't working and climate change intensifies these things? We're off the chart in ways that we don't know. So we've got more hazards than we typically acknowledge, and they're causing more damage more quickly than most people acknowledge. So sometimes when I tell this to folks, they're like, yeah, but that's just you down in the Gulf Coast. I don't have to worry about that. That's on the sea. We'll figure that out. You're like, well, if you look at the maps, here's the flood maps just since 2008 put together by NOAA. So I see a lot of flooding. It's not just on the Gulf. So this seems like, pretty ubiquitous stuff. And they're like, yeah, well, that's floods. You know, what are you going to do? And you know, well, okay, well, what about tornadoes and hurricanes? It's like, whoa, okay. There are a lot of those too. And they're getting that edge and they're hitting different places. But look at that west. Isn't it great to be in Colorado? And isn't it great to be out in California where I went to undergrad? And then you say, well, have you been paying attention to the news, or look at this stuff? These are fires and droughts, which typically go together, since 2008. And as we know, this is all too real this summer and going into fall, unfortunately. And so the point here is that, you know, basically we've got these natural hazards hitting everywhere across the country. You just pick your type. And sometimes in your area, it's going to be higher, sometimes lower. But what we're trying to get at is this movement away from the event and the isolated big event of a big disaster to thinking about this as an ongoing process that's happening everywhere and is ongoing. So when you think about that, you can translate those earlier, more aesthetically pleasing maps into something like this, where it's a county map. So you see little polygons of different colors. This is, again, 2010 to 2015. This is sort of, again, a relatively light 5-year span. And I wanted to show that to show you that I'm not loading the dice or cherry picking here, but the colors represent, the lighter colors represent 1 to 2 hazards. That is hazards where the county or the state or the Fed, somebody in charge at some level said, this is a disaster, we have to mobilize resources to help those in need. And so the gray is where they have no data or there is 0. And I'm pretty sure most of it's no data. But, you know, I challenge you to find the gray on your screen. Maybe you have a bigger screen than I do. It's not very common. And a lot of those polygons are darker orange. So what you're seeing is 5 and 6 or 7 and 8 events over this 5-year span, which again becomes less about a process, or less about an event and more about a process. So again, if the traditional methodology for studying the long-term effects of recovery has been to recently use extended case studies, we need that. Extended case studies of Katrina or Andrew or Joplin or whatever major event has been culturally significant. But when you see a map like this, that methodology becomes difficult, because which event, which place are you going to study? Are you just going to pick the top extreme events? If you do, are those events exceptions or are they examples? We don't know. And what happens when, you know, in Houston, I moved there in 2016, we've had 3 500-year floods in 6 years. It's like, which one is having the effect? And so we're moving to a different age of going and having the extended case study, again, is important, but it becomes really difficult to tease out in a lot of different ways. So we're back to that question. So with the background, do natural hazards affect wealth inequality over time? You know, we've got this dilemma. And so what we want to do, Junie and myself, is, you know, say, well, what if we flip this around? If it's happening everywhere, why start with the event? Why not start with the people? They're the people are the things we care about. So we said, okay, well, why don't we take a population-centered approach that, you know, is common in stratification research in general, and import it into the sociology disaster and randomly sample US households. And then we're pretty sure the disasters are going to come to them, the hazards are going to come to them. And in that case, the variation becomes less of a bug. What do we do? All these things are happening everywhere in different forms, and becomes a feature. Now we've got variation, and we can expose different households to different levels of exposure to these natural hazard damages. So most of you can imagine that, you know, when we went to the provost and said we need $50 million to start a longitudinal study to do this, they're like, we'll give you a little seed money, but we're not going to fund a whole new study. And we, okay, all right, it's worth a shot. So over time, what we'll do is we'll focus on the household, but we'll go out and look at data sets that are already out there. So many of you might be familiar with this one. It's the panel study for income dynamics. It's not just about incomes. It's about a lot of things. And it's sort of the leading gold standard for longitudinal survey work on social matters since the late 1960s out of Michigan. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that survey or study and pull out a householder from those households that they've been following over time. And if we start in 1999, we've got about 3,400 randomly distributed households, which we pull out an individual from, and we can follow over time as they're exposed to different levels of natural hazards in where they live. And we start in 1999 because that's when the PSID refreshed their sample and tried to make it more representative by going out and actually sampling Latinx households. We can talk more about that, but what we have is a survey where data were collected every 2 years, and we've got it over about 14 or 15 years. And so to that, what we're going to do is we're going to add information about direct damages from natural hazards of various sorts, and the N of 3142 is how many counties we actually observe through our randomly sampled individuals. So we get almost entire coverage of the US over time. And as individuals move from one county to another, we follow them and locate them and assign them the county damages there once they get there forward. And then we have FEMA public assistance data. And we can talk about this. The important thing here is it's not about individual assistance data. It's about the publicly funded projects where they're trying to rebuild communities and infrastructure for the public good, not just solve temporary housing or immediate needs. So that's the overview of the structure. So every 2 years, interview. So we got a lot of information in the survey. Individual factors, we got some, for survey purposes, relatively fixed things that don't change much, at least in the survey: gender, race, nativity status. And then we have things that do change over the course of the survey: education, age. Then we got family level factors, you know, are you married, cohabiting, number of children in the household. We also have information on the amount of insurance premiums paid per year. And at that family level, that's where our wealth comes in, where we add up the assets they tell us about, we subtract the debts, and we get an adjusted or estimated wealth that we can follow through time. We also have household factors, whether they're renting or owning, did they move during that 2-year period that they're being interviewed. We also, in this case, got access to the restricted data. So we're able to control for sort of the economic or social class status of the neighborhood. So we have a factor score in there with median income of residents in the census tract, percent with a bachelor's degree employed. And then our county level factors, this is where the hazard damage comes in. That's the lowest unit where we can get that damage across the country. And we have the FEMA assistance at that level, and we also control for total population and sort of a rural scale. So those are the data. And then what we did is we did a lot of modeling that looks like this in a moment, but this is the key independent variable. This is the hazard damages adjusted for inflation over the spell at which we're going to follow people for the 14 or 15 years. And so note that the dark red are the hardest hit areas, and they're scattered quite diversely across the country, but we got a lot of variation. So again, in the extended case study, the variation is a challenge in some respects. Here it's an asset. So we got that, and then we ran a number of panel models. I'm not gonna torture you with more stuff like this, but I wanted to at least show you this, and we've got supplemental models online, but a couple key points. What we're doing with these models, it's the panel model. So we ran it a lot of different ways, but in these analyses that I'm gonna show you, the dependent variable becomes effectively change in wealth over time. So we're following people from 1999 to 2013. And so at the top, you see that hazard damage. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's the first red box thing. We were sort of surprised. The more hazard damage you have in your county, the more wealth tends to go up. It is not a detriment on average to wealth accumulation. Then we also control for the starting wealth in 1999 because we know it accumulates, so we wanted to make sure we held that constant. Then we also controlled for the interview year for each panel so that we net out the average accumulation of wealth for a family over time. So we net that out. we control for the starting point, and we have this. And then, so the key to our analyses are really these interaction terms, where we're taking the amount of hazard damage and interacting it or multiplying it by different indicators of vulnerability or privilege. So we have our racial categories of Black, Latino, and other against the white reference. We have an education, which goes from 0 to 16 in years of education, I think, top coded, and renter versus owner. So again, don't want to torture you, just want to sort of give you a sense of what's going on here and what's happening with model 7 and the amount of things that we're controlling for, including there's a variable in there just over the year on insurance payments. So we're netting that out as well. So this is sort of a stylized graph. So our x-axis is natural hazard damages over this period. And the y-axis is going to be the wealth and what we expect it to be over time as that x-axis increases. So to simplify things, I'm going to take you back to New Orleans. So when I lived there, I lived in Faubourg-de-la-Chaise. It was sort of not far from the Irish Channel, pretty close to the river, and it was a mixed income, mixed race neighborhood. So I'm the white, more educated homeowner, white, more educated. More educated in this case means above a college degree. I was a homeowner. Across the street, my friend Crip, he was Black. He was less than a high school education. He was renting a small little shack in the back. He had just gotten out of Angola in the federal penitentiary from 20 years. So this is as extreme as we get. But statistically, what we're going to do, we're in the same neighborhood, so we're holding that constant. We're going to hold everything else constant. We actually are going to give Crip the same amount of wealth that I had, and statistically sort of just focus on the difference between the two of us here. And so those two dots on the left-hand side is sort of the premium I get for being white and educated homeowner relative to Black, less educated renter, all else equal. So it's about $60,000 difference. This is pretty utopian. There's no way we're going to be the same on everything else, but statistically this is useful. And we know it's utopia now because we started at $0 in hazard damage. That almost doesn't exist. So this is the best case scenario. So what happens as hazard damages hit the neighborhood and the county where we live over this period? And we lag by 1 year. That's why it says 2012 there. So it gives the impacts a year to sort of have their effect on wealth. So this is what happens to Crip. His wealth, which he didn't really have, but statistically in this case, it goes down. It goes down dramatically. It goes almost 0. For a lot of folks, it's going actually negative, that they're incurring a lot more debt than they have assets. We're like, well, that's bleak, but the social vulnerability literature, that makes sense. And we're like, okay, well, what about Jim? He's probably going to lose some money, but probably not as much money. And it's like, let's see what happens. It's like, oh, wow. Jim's wealth actually goes up. The more damage in the county he is, it's like an experiment. We'll put him in the county with no hazard damage. He's going to have this much wealth, and we've controlled for everything else. But if we just move him into a more damaged area, his wealth actually increases. So this starts to raise all sorts of questions, prominently why, and what the implications are. We'll come back to that. The next question we had, if you recall, is, well, what happens if FEMA steps in and helps with long-term recovery? So with our sample over this period, we'll just start by noting that every county got some FEMA aid during this period. Some of it got a little bit, just $1,000 here or there that was trickled down through the state and maybe the county. And then the high range was $7.5 billion. And so the mean after the first wave of interviews is about 5 million per county, and the mean at the end of the study is about 263. Obviously a big standard deviation. So what we're going to do is mimic the same graph again, but what we're going to do is we're going to hold everything constant, including the average hazard damage in the county. So we're going to make an average county in terms of that. What we're going to vary is the amount of FEMA aid that comes in to help. So we got the change in wealth on the y-axis again over this period. We've got myself, we've got Crip across the street, And what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, here we're sort of divided at the beginning if no FEMA aid comes in, and we standardize the amount of damage we've had. Is FEMA going to come in and help sort of bring those lines together and help, or bring the bottom up and help the most vulnerable, or is it going to do something else? So on average, the more FEMA money comes in to the county, the worse an already grim picture is for CRIP. And this is true. I'm using a cumulative effect for being Black, educated, and being a renter, but these happen individually too, white versus Black. And if you kept white constant, less educated versus more educated, renter versus homeowner. So this is sort of a compound effect, but they're also happening within these categories. So, okay, well, that's not great. Maybe it's equal though, maybe they're parallel. No. Not only do we see the divergence before with the impact, but when FEMA gets involved, it actually exacerbates the wealth inequalities. So, rising disaster costs aren't hurting everybody, at least financially. There's definitely trauma, there's definitely experiences of stress, et cetera, and I don't want to minimize those, but financially, better off Americans, whether they realize it or not, are actually doing okay, if not better, as a result of this. So why might this be so? Here's where we're on more speculative ground. So I'll just offer sort of three sort of major things that Junie and I have speculated on. Maybe you have other ideas, but the three basics are, when we recover and we think about long-term recovery, not just immediate emergency response, we start to think about how it is that we use public dollars, not just property taxes, but tax dollars from people at every income level to restore property over community. That's the privilege. And when we do that, we often leverage market-based programs, in part because local administrators are overwhelmed. They need the help of the market. They can't do it themselves quite often. They don't have the resources. There are also obviously power dynamics at stake. And then there's this third component, and they're all sort of wrapped together, of what, you know, going back to Max Weber, but then Parkin and Tilly have talked about as opportunity hoarding. And I'll come back to that, but just an illustration of each one of these sort of quickly. Restoration over property over community. So if property equals wealth, then what you're doing is you're basically coming in and saying, okay, those people who had the most wealth and then lost it get the most help. We need to restore that property. So it's not about getting people up to where they need to be well. It's about making sure those people at the top didn't fall as far. That's the priority when you restore property. And that property is effectively wealth. And we know that wealth and assets and value are socially influenced. So an example that's been given quite a bit, but happens across, I think, a lot of cases, is the Road Home program in New Orleans, Louisiana, when they came back and tried to provide resources to displaced homeowners. And now we're focusing just on homeowners, right? But if you're a white homeowner in a white neighborhood, you know, you could have a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house, but its value is higher because of the social assets of good schools, good infrastructure, lack of stigma, than the same exact house, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, in a largely African-American neighborhood that doesn't have those social resources propping up its value. And so we know that a lot of insurance and payments and subsidies are not just about the reconstruction cost, but the restoration of value. So we have this concern going forward. Then the market-based federal recovery programs. First of all, we have the subsidized flood insurance program. Here's an example in Houston. We've got a neighborhood where the claims just happen almost every year. So you got homes that are worth 115, 114,000 getting payments that are, you know, 6, 7 times that over a relatively short period. So that's taxpayer dollars going to that home. But it's also the case that you need to have assets and a general capability to buy that insurance. Even though it's subsidized, it costs money. And we know that whiter, wealthier neighborhoods, more people are able to buy that. And so if everybody can buy and everybody can sort of be rebuilt, that restores the social value. If you're in a neighborhood where you can't have that happening, maybe one person can buy insurance, the other person can't, and now you begin to have blight that brings down the value of your neighborhood and your home through no fault of your own. Then what happens when you flood? Well, some of the things I've been studying recently is the federal buyout program, and not to go too much into that, many of you might know, to avoid keep paying out payment after payment, the federal government has a program of voluntarily buying people out. There are lots of pieces to that, but in Houston, when we studied that, what we found is that a lot of neighborhoods were targeted for buyouts, but not a whole lot of neighborhoods took the buyout because it's voluntary, it's up to the individual homeowner. And we're like, okay, well, what are the characteristics of place that encourage more people to take the buyout and return their home to nature and have it act as sort of flood retention? And we looked at a lot of different things, and it's not the amount of money that's paid for the home, it's not the racial composition at the time, it's the amount of white flight that's happened in neighborhoods up to the point of the buyout offer. The more white flight, the more it is that basically white homeowners say, okay, it's time to get out, and the neighborhood shifts from a reasonably integrated to an increasingly non-white, underserved neighborhood. Finally, the opportunity hoarding. In related research, what we found is that over time, it's interesting, not only does more hazard damage in your county increase the average wealth, and now we know where that average wealth goes, it goes to the privileged, but actually opens up new businesses. We had county business pattern data, and more damage, more businesses. So there's more opportunity, more recovery capital coming in. It also opens up more nonprofits, particularly of the bonding social capital type, churches, other organizations which have historically been shown to be more insular. They build and protect their own constituents rather than bridge to other neighborhoods and other collectives in the place. And also doing some work with a current grad student on self-employment. And in short, what we're finding is the more hazard damage you have in an area, the more Latinx self-employment rates go up. But when FEMA money comes in, that goes down, and white self-employments go up pretty noticeably. So FEMA is basically creating opportunities for white self-employed. On average, in $1 billion county or hit with $1 billion in property, you get 700 more white self-employed than you would otherwise expect. Okay, so bringing it near close, we started with this, and what I wanted to point out is this is a snapshot, but we've had this moving picture. This baby boy is not a baby anymore. He's 15 or 16, and all the things that we've looked at in terms of the data suggest that he is in a worse situation than he would have been if this not helped. And it's even worse when FEMA stepped in. Not that that was their intent, but that's the effect. The other thing that we sort of seen is that maybe this should not be the iconic picture of what's been happening when we turn this snapshot into a moving picture. Maybe the iconic picture is actually one of privilege. And the one of privilege is a problem for two reasons. One, if people don't know they're being helped, but they're being helped, they're gonna have different interests in how this all unfolds and how we attack this problem going forward. So there's the interest problem. How do you get political will behind reforming these situations? Two, and more conceptually for us as academics, it shifts the paradigm a bit. It says we've been focusing a lot on social vulnerability, sort of with this iconic picture, but maybe what's really happening is one of social privilege, where it's extracting public resources and it's pulling it up in certain ways that don't allow much political will or resources to assist here. Oh. Oh. So I'd end there, but that's sort of depressing. So maybe you could help us think it through. But when Junie and I think about how we can put this into action, we've done three things so far, but we need help and thoughts. So one of it is that we've used this paper to help local legal aid operations, particularly in Houston, where we can project, here are the consequences for different neighborhoods and different groups if you do business as usual, so that they can submit the briefs and put this out and basically file, you know, class action suits in federal court. So that's going on. We're doing that. The other is legislative. So we're not the only people to study this, so we were certainly standing on the shoulders of others and bringing this in, but for whatever reason, the study that I just showed you caught the attention of Elizabeth Warren and Benny Thompson, and they brought it to the attention of Congress, and so we've consulted and presented to the Government Accountability Office in DC, the GAO, the research wing of Congress, to sort of think about these dimensions and get the conversation going. Elizabeth Warren even developed some plans on how to move this forward. And the last thing is the scientific, thinking about how we can get more data to make this problem more visible and keep it going. So there's some strategic plans at Fema, and Junie has been great in working with Fema. I think just a couple weeks ago, she was on a meeting with their director and talking with them about how to move forward. And you can imagine there's some politics there, but at least we're on the radar and thinking about how to target these issues and get more data. And we're also now talking with folks in California and various county and state offices about how they might collect information and roll out things that are more equitable, not just from these year's fires, but the PG&E settlements from the utility company settlements. They were the ones who started fires a couple of years ago. You know, counties often have a couple $100 million to spend. How do they insert the equity issue into the equation and use some of the research that all of us have been presenting to sort of leverage that to the table? So with that, I'll go ahead and close, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was an outstanding talk, and it's been generating a lot of chat in the chat box. And so what I'm going to ask is, there are already several people who put questions in the chat box. So if you have questions and want to ask them of Jim, will you pop your name in the chat box and I'll just run through it. So we're going to start with Krister just had a quick question about one of the maps that you showed. So Krister, would you ask the first question to get this section going? And Jim, thank you again for that outstanding presentation. Krister?
Thanks. Yeah, that was an outstanding presentation. Really, well, very impressed, but also a bit depressed by the findings. So I just had a quick question about the map that you showed before you got into the results about the disasters at the county level from 2010 to 2015. But Laura, you already said it probably comes from ASU.
Oh, okay.
Or group there. Is that the source?
I didn't go through too much of the detail. Chris, I think I'm going to avoid trying to bring the map back up if I can, but yeah. We can imagine it's got a lot, right. So ASU, but before that, University of South Carolina, this is the work that Susan Cutter had put together for the SHELDA database that's been trying to update regularly. And I think it has moved institutionally to ASU, but right. So it's those data, yep.
Okay, can I just ask more of a substantive question too?
Yep.
So, I mean, the most striking findings to me is the finding that even the federal government support tends to widen the gap between the poor, the rich and the poor, and the race in this case. Are there examples of a different type of intervention, perhaps not a federal level intervention? Are there other programs that we might expect to have a different effect? Like, are there some positive experiences from policy interventions, maybe at the state level, or maybe from other countries, that does not fall into this inequality trap, if you will?
The short answer is undoubtedly, but we're not able to pick them up with the data. But certainly in the experience of New Orleans or other places, there are amazing public-private partnerships around housing, for instance, and generating housing. What this research suggests that is that maybe there are lessons there, but at this point they aren't scaled to the point we need them. So the question you're asking, I think, is the one we're all searching for. When I talk to the people on the phone, it's like, how do we turn your research into action? We're like, right, let's work this out. And when we have conversations, it oftentimes has to do with the politics of the local area. You know, some areas, they feel like they get more traction when they can talk about park development and mitigation, but then sort of work with the housing. Other places, they seem to have different perspectives. They work with the schools and how do you leverage that and build programs out. But I think that's what we're struggling with, is how to identify these programs that actually extend outwards, because a lot of what we're seeing is a lot of amazing work around what we would call these sort of smaller organizational efforts. That, as good as they are, in some senses we found might even subtract resources. So for instance, in Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, a number of church organizations and synagogues and whatnot did amazing work, continuing to do amazing work in helping folks. But what's happened is, you know, this is somewhat anecdotally, we know that some of those larger churches used to send resources and people into underserved communities, and at Harvey they said, you know, we can't afford to do that, we've got to take care of our own. So there's a retraction there. So the challenge is not just finding the ways to do it, but finding the ways to do it that are inclusive. And you know, the legal system provides a way to sort of try to fix things and get resources, hopefully, to the people who can actually make decisions for themselves and empower them. But I think the first thing is to figure out how you channel recovery resources into communities and engage them and ask them what they need, because it's going to be variable, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Krister. Steph, you were next up in the chat box and had some compelling comments. Do you want to share any comments or a question with Jim?
It was just anecdotal. Jim might want to take a look at it later, but you know, the way this was playing out in Boulder, that suggests perhaps, at least on the ground level, FEMA doing this almost, it seemed deliberate to me.
You mean channeling the money towards powerful interests?
Their appeals process. Yeah, you can just see in the chat, but it's not worth taking up time for.
Okay. I'll just note that I'm currently in Boulder, and my dad lives down in Fraser Meadows, which experienced some flooding, you know, when the big flood, and they were able to organize as a neighborhood and sort of file some suits, but everybody seemed well insured, and you know, we had some stress, but you know, there's a new basement and new appliances, and so it's not been, you know, materially a setback for him and his neighbors.
Right. No, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And just a little bit of anecdotal evidence about how that might be actively done by FEMA.
Yeah, no, and I have to give a shout out to a couple of my colleagues. Rachel Kimbrough is an excellent scholar and friend at Rice, and she's been studying the Meyerland neighborhood, which is a traditionally middle-class Jewish community in Houston that floods quite repetitively, and is coming out with a book soon called Flooded, and exposes some of the mechanisms. And they're good mechanisms in the sense it's people rallying around their school, their community, and their stuff. But you go back and look at their school, they've got a brand new garden in the middle. I mean, it is souped up. They have bounce forward for sure, and it's sort of, they don't have time to manage their own issues and everybody else's. So and then I've got a colleague, Sergio Chavez, who's sort of studying the other side, which is he's looking at the Ruferos, the basically Mexican, I won't even call them Mexican American because they're typically foreign-born labor who make their living going from place to place, you know, repairing roofs, and the struggles they face in occupational safety, wage theft, and these sorts of things. So it's not just the residents of these areas that are experiencing some of the way these works. And we know with FEMA and prior things, when the money comes in to recover, suddenly a lot more layers of the subcontracting world open up. Used to be, you know, you could get the job done in 2 levels, and now there are 5 levels because people are well positioned to get their cut. But
Thank you, Steph and Jim. David, do you want to pose a question? Oh, David, I think you're muted.
I think the question was answered, so I will defer to, I think, let's see, I saw a grad student who had a question there, so I'll defer my time to them.
Okay, thank you, David. Fernando, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Very interesting talk. I guess the one question I had, well, I had a couple, but I'll keep it short so we have time for Simon's question as well. When you show the disparity between in terms of wealth growth between the Black individual and a white individual, but they had also different levels of education and home ownership. What happens when you, for instance, you have a privileged person, when you basically fix that education and home ownership the same? I mean, is there basically, do better off Black individuals benefit enough that the race differential gets a little, I mean, do they experience increases in wealth similar to white individuals? And I don't know if you tried those three-way interactions or four-way interactions as they be, but at the very least, right, with the average differences between the Blacks and whites, was there a relevant difference there?
Should I go ahead and take that, or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay,
Oh, sorry.
so yeah, no, great question. So, right, so if we held constant education and home ownership, I sort of showed you the exaggerated version of that in part because that's oftentimes how the world works. These are accumulative disadvantages and privileges. But it is true that even when we compare, you know, white educated homeowners against Black educated homeowners, we still see a significant disparity. It's not quite as wide, but it's there. And so nothing we've been able to do with the slew of variables that we've seen really minimizes that. The Latinx divergences are a little bit more fluctuated. The divide doesn't seem as stubborn when you control across these things. But when I've talked to other people too, and they talk about the politics of it, they say, stop showing that graph. Some of them say that. What you should do is show the divide among white people. And you should really focus on holding race constant, show how better off white folks do relative to less, well, even if they're homeowners, we still, if we compare less educated white homeowners against better educated white homeowners, we still see that divide. We still see when FEMA comes in, the divide increase. So this gets into some of the framing and the politics and the local context of what resonates.
Thank you. And then Simone, you're next up. And then I see Colleen has a follow-on question as well. So 2 more questions, 2 more minutes. So Simone, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was incredibly fascinating. I'm curious about the decision to use public assistance instead of individual assistance, and if that might have, like if you were to include individual assistance, would you see an even larger gap in disparities? And I'm also curious because Chris Emmerich and I have a paper about public assistance, and we didn't find nearly as much evidence for some of these disparities. We found some, but not as much. And I'm wondering, because we were looking at only federally declared disasters, counties with federally declared disasters. So we weren't looking at the total sum of damages done by these sort of like sub-disaster events. And so I'm curious if like part of this mechanism is because those disasters are only triggered by a certain damage threshold. So it could be that folks, with that their properties aren't worth that much to begin with or something like that, that cumulative, constant, repetitive damage, but that doesn't trigger like the federal assistance, that has some kind of bearing on these, on the disparities.
Yeah, Simone, as expected, excellent questions. So it's been a while since we probed the data, and it could be that what you're saying is true, that maybe in front loading some of the smaller studies that create the damage but aren't eligible in a sense for the FEMA public assistance because they haven't been declared, that we should put in sort of a, this gets in the weeds, a dummy variable that says, can you be there, yes or no, and interact it, and then have that. So great question. I can't give you a clean answer here. What I can do is maybe just provide some brief context on why we did that, not individual assistance, and then a follow. And you might already know this. The public assistance we were interested in because those numbers and data seemed more reliable when we were trying to get the AI stuff. There was good stuff, but not consistently good stuff. So we decided public investment, data quality, but also because that was an investment in the community. That was typically these larger scale programs. And we had the hunch that those are programs that are actually improving neighborhoods that might be socially privileged. So you get a new drainage system, you get a new playground, or you get new infrastructure disproportionately in helping in that. And we wanted to focus on that community aspect and how it was not going there, not focus on the individual level. So that was a little bit of the sociologist in us. The last thing I'll mention is the individual assistance. There are folks working on that. So I'm about to be an external member of a dissertation defense soon. Ethan Raker at Harvard, who I worked with when he was at Rice as a postbac before he went to grad school, has been analyzing millions and millions and millions of records of FEMA individual assistance claims and showing how the different gateways in those decision making of who gets what when is a form of disaster welfare that excludes people in the same way that other housing-based programs exclude people at different stages along the way. So it's this cumulative process where there's not one thing that is working to exclude people or include people. It's just a series of decisions and business as usual. The stuff that I presented does not require any conspiracy or ne'er-do-wells. When I meet with folks at FEMA who are in the trenches and at the GAO who are in the trenches, I have nothing but respect for them. They're trying to get this stuff done. The people at the top are a bit defensive about things because they're saying that's not really our job to fix inequality. But the folks doing the research really want to tackle this. So yay, keep doing what you're doing. I know you're doing awesome work in Louisiana. I think that would be a great case study to see. And I know you're talking to folks about how you know, local officials and key stakeholders are making this happen. And that's the work we need. We've got the big picture, so it's happening everywhere. You've got the research and the trajectory to show us how and how we can actually get in and figure some of this stuff out and how to fix it. So, yay.
So Jim, and to everybody who's still on here, I know some people had to jump off quickly to go to class. And Jim, I'm just reminded yet again that one of the things I miss during this pandemic world is the sound of uproarious applause, which I know would be heading your way right now. Thank you for taking the time today to share this talk with us. Thank you to everybody for joining us today for what we promised would be a fascinating talk and was a fascinating talk. Thank you again to the Institute of Behavioral Science, Department of Sociology, Hazard Center, and Environment and Society program. And most of all, thank you to you, Jim Elliott, and your colleagues for the work you're doing to try to make this nation a safer and more equitable place. So everyone have a great day. Jim, take good care and stay in Boulder as long as you can. We'd like to keep you, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Appreciate it.